Envision a vault, not a bank vault. The kind of vault that hums quietly in a server farm, a climate-controlled, fluorescent-lit cathedral of machines. Inside that vault sits the most intimate map you will ever own. Not your social security number, not your medical chart, your blueprint, your DNA. Most of us were told it was just a fun kit, a spit tube that could tell us whether our great-great-grandparents took a ship across the Atlantic or whether our taste for cilantro was coded at birth. It felt harmless, it felt exciting, it felt like the future. But ask yourself one uncomfortable question. When your DNA left your house in a postage-paid box, where did the chain of custody end? And where did a new one begin? Tonight, we pull on that thread, not to accuse, but to understand. We're going to walk through what these companies say they do, what they actually do, and what others, governments, researchers, law enforcement, investors, and yes, criminals, try to do around the edges. We'll keep our feet planted in public facts, and when we venture into claims and speculation, we'll mark it clearly. Because the story of consumer DNA is not just ancestry and health reports. It's about ownership, consent, money, power, national security, and an old question with a new twist. Who are you, and who gets to say? First, the ground truth. Consumer genetic testing companies advertise a simple exchange. You give a saliva sample and some answers to surveys. They provide ancestry breakdowns, health trait reports, and relative matching features that have reunited siblings and solved family mysteries. The experience can be joyful, moving, and undeniably useful. But the fine print matters. Most companies state that you own your DNA and your raw genetic data. They also explain that if you choose, you can opt into research or data sharing that goes far beyond your personal dashboard. Opt-in is the operative phrase. For many users, that's where the story ends. For the companies, that's where the business begins. Over the last decade, consumer DNA firms transformed into data platforms. Yes, they still sell kits, but the strategic value lives in the database, a living, growing, recontactable cohort of millions of people who have consented to be part of research. That database powers collaborations with major pharmaceutical companies, where de-identified aggregated data can help discover new drug targets. The pitch is straightforward. Genetics can point to causal pathways in disease. Knowing those pathways can shorten the path to treatments, and the people who opt in are contributing to science. It's a compelling narrative, and often a real one. But here's a second, equally important narrative. De-identification is not a magic spell. It lowers risk. It does not erase it. Genetic data is inherently identifying. It doesn't just say something about you, it says something about your relatives, born and unborn. In other words, your opt-in draws a circle bigger than yourself. There's another truth that tends to get buried under the marketing. Consumer DNA companies typically are not covered by the same federal privacy law that shields your medical records at the hospital. HIPAA protects information handled by health providers and plans. But when you mail your cheek cells to a private genealogy firm, you're mostly stepping outside HIPAA's walls and into a patchwork of consumer protection rules and state-level genetic privacy laws. Some states have stepped in with statutes that require express consent for certain uses. That's progress. It's not uniform. Now, if the story were only about targeted ads and de-identified research, we could stop here. But in late 2023, a breach ripped through the calm. Attackers didn't magically crack vault doors. They walked in through front doors, left ajar by reused passwords, the kind of credential stuffing attack that takes leaked passwords from one site and tries them on another. Once inside a subset of accounts, the intruders scraped relative matching features to compile data on people who never logged in that day, building lists tied to specific heritage groups. The company said the raw genetic files weren't taken. Regulators still levied penalties and the lawsuits mounted anyway. For millions of ordinary people, buried in the fine print came a blunt question. How did a stranger get a glimpse into my family tree? And then came the cascade, a crisis of trust, calls to delete data, a restructuring, a bankruptcy filing, a sale approved by the court, and promises, some court-enforced, about how existing privacy commitments would carry forward under new ownership. Legal accountability is one part of rebuilding trust. The other part is cultural. People asking, should I have done this? Should I leave my DNA in that vault? Before we answer, we need to widen the frame. There is a world adjacent to consumer DNA that rarely makes the commercials: investigative genetic genealogy. You've heard at least one famous story. A serial murderer evaded capture for decades until investigators used crime scene DNA to build a genetic profile compatible with public genealogy sites. They found distant relatives, built a family tree, and landed on a suspect. It was a watershed moment for cold cases, but it also triggered a policy reckoning. Within months, a popular public genealogy site flipped its default so law enforcement access became opt-in only. The U.S. Justice Department issued interim guidelines. Use this tool for serious violent crimes, exhaust traditional methods first, respect privacy, get appropriate legal process. That's one version of guardrails. Another version? A different vendor built 3D DNA portraits of suspects from phenotyping predictions: hair, eye, skin tone. And some investigators later tried to run those renderings through facial recognition. Scientific debate erupted over whether such composites are reliable enough to point at real faces in real databases. The point isn't to litigate every technique tonight. It's to acknowledge the reality. Once DNA moves from your tube to any database, consumer, public, or law enforcement facing, its second-order uses multiply. There's also a national security layer that's new to the public conversation but old to defense planners. As gene editing tools matured, military researchers funded programs not to weaponize biology, but to build safeguards, reversals, and counters, because if a technology exists, someone could misuse it. Around the same time, defense officials warned U.S. service members to avoid consumer DNA kits altogether, citing risks from data breaches to surveillance to career impacts from inaccurate tests. On the geopolitical stage, major powers tightened rules around exporting or collecting human genetic resources, citing biosecurity and national interests. Put simply, governments now view human genetic data as strategic. None of this proves a conspiracy, but it does prove a market, and markets create incentives. Let's look at incentives plainly. Consumer DNA companies win when new people test. When tested, people stay engaged, and when those people consent to research. Platform partners win when large cohorts help generate insights that lead to therapies. Researchers win when they can recontact participants for follow-up. Insurers might be tempted to win by learning more about risk, though in the United States there is a federal law that forbids health insurers and employers from using genetic information to discriminate. That law does not generally extend to life, disability, or long-term care insurers, so those markets build their own rules. Meanwhile, the cybercrime market wins every time we reuse passwords. This is the ecosystem that your DNA enters. Neither dystopia nor utopia, just a web of promises, profits, policies, and probabilities. So what then is the phantom DNA harvest? It's not a single villain with a secret pipeline. It's the uneasy feeling that once our genomes enter private vaults, the data's gravity starts to pull new uses toward it. Research, policing, advertising, underwriting, national defense. Some noble, some gray, some we would flatly reject. The harvest is the widening circle of claimants on your code, each with their own rationale, legal theory, and business model. The phantom is the distance between what we think we consented to and what the system can eventually do. Let's walk through the layers more slowly. Ownership and control. Companies say you own your DNA and data. In practice, you grant licenses to analyze your sample and, if you opt in, to include your de-identified information in research and data sharing. Most policies promise you can withdraw consent, delete data, and request sample destruction. That's good, but withdrawals are often prospective. Research already performed may remain. De-identified sets shared with partners may persist by design. And in mergers or bankruptcies, courts, regulators, and buyers negotiate what happens next. In a recent highly watched case, a buyer promised to honor existing privacy policies and made specific commitments to deletion and opt-outs, with regulators scrutinizing the terms. That's reassuring. It also underlines the reality. Your personal genome can become a bankruptcy asset, not because anyone is auctioning your bodily autonomy, but because the legal system treats databases, under restrictions, as property to be transferred. That is the starkest reminder that your DNA, once digitized, sits inside a corporate life cycle, not just a family scrapbook. Security and breaches. No system is invulnerable, but some are more exposed than others. The 2023 incident didn't require a company's internal systems to be hacked in the Hollywood sense. It relied on users reusing passwords and a feature that exposed network data. The lesson is boring and brutal. Weak authentication plus social features equals blast radius. The fix is equally unglamorous. Enable multi-factor authentication, rate limit scraping, lock accounts after anomalous behavior, segment data, and design social features to resist scraping at scale. Regulators in one country imposed a multi-million-pound fine for failing to prevent a known attack vector, and a class action settlement in the U.S. forced additional changes and monitoring. Those are accountability signals. They also show that opt-in doesn't protect you from a neighbor's password habits if a platform's design allows lateral data pull. Law and loopholes. In the U.S., HIPAA doesn't usually apply to consumer DNA companies. The FTC can act against unfair or deceptive practices. That's real power, as one genetic startup learned when it retroactively changed its privacy policy and got smacked. Some states have enacted genetic privacy laws requiring express consent and restricting disclosure. Others are following. Employment and health insurance discrimination based on genetics is unlawful under federal law. Life, disability, and long-term care generally aren't covered. That's a gap, and several consumer alerts from state attorneys general have told people to think hard before handing over a genome, especially if they're shopping for those products. None of this is to scare you. It's to replace vibe with vocabulary. Know which laws apply, which don't, and where your choices matter. Law enforcement and ethics. For many families, genetic genealogy has delivered justice unthinkable a decade ago, identifying serial offenders, exonerating the innocent, naming the nameless dead. For civil liberties groups, it raises real concerns about informed consent, scope creep, and the temptation to use consumer profiles in ways the contributors never imagined. The U.S. DOJ's interim policy tries to strike a balance, focus on serious violent crimes and unidentified human remains, seek warrants, exhaust CAUDIS first, preserve chain of custody standards, minimize retention. Meanwhile, popular public genealogy sites now require an explicit opt-in to be included in law enforcement searches, dramatically shrinking the searchable pool. Why should you care? Because I never opted in only protects you if your cousin did the same. National security and bio-risk. Defense planners would be derelict if they ignored the possibility that genetic information could be misused, whether to tailor biological agents, to track individuals, or to build predictive dossiers. That's not the same as saying such weapons exist or that they are effective. Biology is messy, and race-specific sci-fi often collapses under scientific scrutiny. But the perception of risk is enough to drive policy. In 2019, the Pentagon told service members to skip the holiday DNA kits. In the early 2020s, countries tightened controls over genetic data, treating human genomes as strategic resources. And the U.S. invested in safe genes programs to build brakes and countermeasures in case gene editing is misused. You don't have to buy the darkest scenarios to understand why the stewardship of large consumer datasets matters beyond medicine. Artificial intelligence and the prediction temptation. As datasets grow, researchers use machine learning to correlate genetic variants with traits, diseases, and sometimes, more controversially, facial features. Predicting appearance from DNA is an active research area. Today, it can estimate some traits like eye, hair, and skin color with decent accuracy, and age with clever techniques. Predicting a full, reliable face from DNA alone remains scientifically contested. Still, the temptation is there to take DNA, generate a face, and then feed that face into facial recognition systems. Some investigators have tried. Experts, ethicists, and many scientists urge caution or outright rejection. Regardless, the arc is clear. Bigger data creates new predictive possibilities. Whether we, as a society, should allow those predictions to leave the lab is a policy question, not a technical one. So is there a phantom? If by ghost you mean a secret back channel siphoning the world's DNA into a single black site, The answer is, we saw no evidence of that. If by ghost you mean a set of forces, commercial, governmental, criminal, that collectively pull our genetic data toward more uses than we expected, often faster than laws can track, then yes, there's something spectral moving in the edges of the frame. It's not a monster, it's momentum. Now, because this is HAlt, here's where we interrogate the edges, clearly labeled as questions, not conclusions. Could a DNA database enable targeted biological threats? In theory, knowing population-level genetic vulnerabilities could inform malicious design. In practice, biology's complexity, environmental factors, and immune variability make precision bioweapons far harder than a headline implies. Defense agencies plan for worst-case scenarios, fund countermeasures, and flag risks. That's their job. It does not mean there's a secret program building such weapons at a consumer company. The right public question is simpler. Should any private entity hold millions of genomes without uniform security standards, mandatory breach reporting within hours, and federal deletion rights? That's a policy design problem, not a conspiracy. Could your DNA affect your ability to get life insurance? In the U.S., federal law prohibits health insurers and employers from using genetic information to discriminate. That protection does not generally extend to life, disability, or long-term care. Some states add safeguards, many don't. Is there a wave of denials because of consumer DNA tests? We didn't find convincing public evidence of a mass trend, but the legal possibility exists, and insurers are in the business of risk. That's not a shadowy plan. It's an industry incentive. If that bothers you, you have a lever. Tell lawmakers to close the gap. Could AI reconstruct your face from your genome? Researchers can estimate some features. Law enforcement composites built from DNA have been used, and at least one department tried to run such a composite through facial recognition, raising loud ethical alarms. The science isn't close to a reliable one-to-one face yet, but the trajectory is obvious. Prediction gets better with data and compute. The policy question is whether we should draw bright lines now, before the tech moves faster than the guardrails. Could a future buyer change the rules on your data? In a bankruptcy context, privacy policies can become terms that courts enforce on buyers. Regulators and attorneys general have intervened to bind a new owner to old promises. That's good. But relying on heroic case-by-case fixes is a fragile way to protect something as permanent as DNA. The structural fix is clearer laws that make certain promises non-transferable and non-waivable. That's not anti-business. That's pro-trust. Let's pivot to what you can do today, without paranoia, without panic, with eyes wide open. If you've tested with a consumer DNA company, log in and review your settings. Make sure multi-factor authentication is on. Change your password, never reuse it anywhere. Review whether you opted into research, and if you did, whether you still want to be in. If the platform offers granular choices, what categories can be used, by whom, use them. If you're uneasy, request deletion of your data and destruction of your physical sample. Keep a record of confirmations. Understand that deletion is usually forward-looking. It won't unwind research already done with your consent. If you haven't tested but are considering it, think about your family. Your choice implicates theirs. Discuss it. If you're in the market for life, disability, or long-term care insurance, consider whether testing before you lock in a policy could alter underwriting. That's not medical advice. It's basic situational awareness. If you believe DNA-powered genealogy saved lives and caught violent offenders, and many can point to specific cases, that belief can coexist with privacy boundaries. If you upload to public genealogy platforms, decide whether to opt into law enforcement matching. Know that opting in helps solve crimes and identify the unknown dead. Know also that it expands the searchable web that can touch your relatives. Neither choice is immoral. Both are consequential. If you're a policymaker, or you know one, there are concrete upgrades that could harden this space without strangling it. Make multi-factor authentication mandatory for genetic platforms. Require prompt, plain language breach notices. Extend deletion rights federally for genetic data. Clarify that bankruptcy courts cannot approve transfers that dilute previously granted privacy commitments. Incentivize independent audits for security and re-identification risk. codify the DOJ's forensic genealogy limits, and require warrants for uploads to consumer databases. Encourage research, but pair it with non-negotiable consent and opt-out rights that are easy to exercise, not buried. And if you're in the industry, this is your moment to lead. Spark joy with ancestry stories and health insights, yes, but put equal budget behind security, transparency, and user control. Treat genomic data like the hazardous material it is: powerful, potentially life-saving, and risky if mishandled. Publish aggregate transparency reports about requests from law enforcement and civil litigants. Reward responsible disclosure from security researchers. Give users a one-click way to see every consent they've ever given, every study their data touched, and every partner that received a derived data set. You will earn more trust and more customers by treating deletion as a right, not a ticket to customer support limbo. We promised to keep this algorithm friendly, so let's end where we began. No accusations, just questions worth asking in public. What is the true cost of curiosity when curiosity is coded in nucleotides? Who should profit from a database built from the intimacy of millions? If cures and therapies come from our pooled genomes, what does a fair return look like, not just for investors, but for contributors? How should we steward data that describes not just who we are, but who we might become? And most of all, what future are we building when the quiet hum of a server farm holds the family secrets of a civilization? If the last decade was about marveling at what our DNA can tell us, the next decade should be about deciding who it can tell. Not because a phantom is stalking the vaults, but because good stewardship won't happen by accident. As always on HAlt, we don't tell you what to think. We bring you the map, we mark the cliffs and the bridges, and we ask you to look down, look ahead, and choose your route. If you want us to dig into the papers, the policies, and the court filings behind tonight's story, check the notes. If you want us to go deeper on any of these subplots, the law enforcement piece, the bankruptcy terms, the national security layer, the face from DNA debate, say the word. And if you've used one of these tests and your life changed for the better, tell us that story too. Because the truth about the phantom DNA harvest isn't one thing. It's thousands of choices made by millions of people flowing into a system that's still being built. The question isn't whether someone harvested your DNA. The question is whether we will harvest the wisdom to govern it. Follow HAlt videos for more hidden history and ancient mysteries.